روح يا ابو النصر خد ساتر يا طخ باكسين
وزع يا شباب توزع. روح الدبابه ماكله قذيفه يا اخواننا. واحد يطلع فيها.
انت معصب.
كيلو هادي عليا. واه شو سدي لك روح.
ايش بتستنوا؟ ايش بتستنوا؟
وين الجنود؟ وين؟
استنى من وين انت؟
عامل انزل هادف الزر هات اغراضنا.
استنى
Now, as horrible as this footage was that we just witnessed, I can assure you that this isn't even the tip of the iceberg in terms of what actually transpired on the morning of the 7th. Those of you who would have seen some of the videos that were coming from the site of the Nova Music Festival, the civilian homes and kibbutzim of southern Israel and Gaza on X and other social media platforms would know exactly how graphic and disturbing the content of those videos was. Needless to say, much of that cannot be and should not be shown anywhere out of respect for the survivors, their families, and for those who lost their lives that day. I'm also sensitive to the fact that the conflict between Israel and its neighbors didn't start in 2023, but that it's a historic one that had its rudimentary beginnings in the foundation of the early political Zionism that was laid down by thinkers like Leon Pinsker and Theodor Herzl. But I feel that what happened on the 7th and how Israel responded over the next days and weeks is really revealing of what each side actually stands for and the means that they're willing to employ in order to get to the goals that they've set for themselves. So on this episode of The Bottomline, we'll be discussing the book On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel, Hamas, and the Future of the West by Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray is a conservative British political commentator. He's also an author, a cultural critic, and a journalist. He is someone who has engaged in live frontline reporting from active war zones, especially during the recent Russia-Ukraine conflict, and also spent months in Israel and Gaza post the October 7th massacre. He is currently an associate editor of the conservative British political magazine The Spectator, to which he's been contributing to since the year 2000. He has also written regularly for numerous other outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the Sunday Times, the Sun, the Evening Standard, and the New York Post. Born in Hammersmith, London in 1979, to an English schoolteacher mother and a Scottish civil servant father, Douglas Murray rose to prominence as a fearless writer and a prolific debater. He has spoken at a variety of platforms, including the British Parliament, European parliaments, and the White House. Now, being a vocal critic of Western capitulation to Islamist ideology, critics have often called some of his work as Islamophobic and branded him as an anti-Muslim polemicist and a right-wing provocateur. His 2005 book on neoconservatism, however, was lauded as masterly by none other than Christopher Hitchens himself, who's an intellectual heavyweight in his own right. Murray has extensively written and spoken on topics like identity politics, social justice, cancel culture, religious fundamentalism, anti-Semitism, the erosion of Western values, the dangers of Islamism, and the challenges of mass immigration in Western societies. His previous bestsellers have been The Strange Death of Europe, The Madness of Crowds, and The War in the West. Based on his time spent in Israel and Gaza in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, Douglas Murray offers an incredibly gripping account of what the attack was like. He argues that the fundamental Western values of capitalism, individual rights, democracy, and reason make Israel a beacon of progress in a region that is marred by extremist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah that are driven by religious fundamentalism and an ideology of martyrdom and jihad. The level of hatred, fanaticism, and radicalization on display by these terrorist groups cannot be overstated. And they've been driven to this point not by some genocidal military state as Israel is often labeled as, but instead by specific religious convictions that make coexistence with the Jewish state simply intolerable for religious fundamentalists. It's really crucial to understand that members of these terrorist groups really do believe in an idea of jihad, martyrdom, and afterlife, and they're willing to sacrifice not only themselves in pursuit of this ideology, but also extinguish the lives of innocent civilians and their own children in the process. Since 2006, Western countries like Canada, US, UK, Germany, and France have been pouring in hundreds of millions of dollars in aid into Gaza and the West Bank. Murray writes that according to the Associated Press, between 2014 and 2020, UN agencies sent almost $4.5 billion to Gaza, with funding from Qatar alone totaling a whopping $1.3 billion. Most of the UN funding to Gaza has gone through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Since 2007, the money that has gone into Gaza ended up in the hands of Hamas without exception, that used it to smuggle in weapons including AK-47s, grenades, explosive devices, rocket launchers, and the Katyusha rockets from the Soviet era. On a strip of land that's about 40 kilometers in length and about 9 kilometers wide on average, the Hamas leadership has managed to assiduously build an underground network of tunnels that's longer than 560 kilometers, with around 6,000 different tunnel entrances, most of which are hidden in civilian houses, mosques, hospitals, schools, and other non-military buildings. Murray writes that by the start of 2023, the international community had made every Hamas leader into a billionaire. By then, Ismail Haniyeh, Mossa Abu Marzouk, and Khalid Mashal were estimated to have a combined worth of some $11 billion. While claiming that their people were living in a poverty-stricken concentration camp, these leaders lived in luxury hotels and penthouses in Doha. Haniyeh alone, the leader of the Hamas political bureau on 7th October, was worth more than $4 billion, while Abu Marzouk and Mashal were worth $3 billion and over $4 billion respectively. Every dollar that they stole was money that could have been used to actually improve the lives of Palestinians. Instead of buying weapons, building tunnels for terrorists, and living the high life in Doha, they might have actually created the Singapore on the Mediterranean that so many people hoped for when Gaza was handed to the Palestinians in 2005. The needless suffering that has been made to visit upon the innocent Palestinians of Gaza is not a result of the kinetic military force exercised by the men and women of the IDF, but instead it's this death cult-like ideology of Hamas that has stolen and diverted billions of dollars in aid to smuggle in weapons, use civilians as human shields, and intentionally built military buildings and command and control centers within and amid civilian homes, hospitals, mosques, and schools. It's easy to lose sight of these facts in an age of social media where outrage and emotions can be leveraged and narratives can be spun with such ease. Chapter 1 begins with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was overthrown and Ayatollah Khomeini, a fanatical Shiite leader living in exile for 14 years in Paris, came back to Iran. This was followed by the Ayatollah and his supporters quickly seizing power and killing their domestic political opponents, including the communists and trade unionists who had actually helped the Islamists to overthrow the Shah. Now, despite this, there were some Western intellectuals and journalists who celebrated Khomeini's seizing power in Iran. One prominent figure among them was Michel Foucault, the left-wing French philosopher and political activist who saw Khomeini as bringing a spiritual revolution to Iran that would finally do away with the Western sins of capitalism and materialism. Richard Falk, professor emeritus at Princeton, greeted the Iranian Revolution by reassuring readers of the New York Times that the depiction of Ayatollah Khomeini as fanatical and the crude bearer of prejudices seems certainly and happily false. And in a subsequent piece for Foreign Policy titled Khomeini's Promise, he added that Khomeini's Islamic Republic can be expected to have a doctrine of social justice at its core, and that from all indications it will be flexible in interpreting the Quran. Needless to say, nothing could have been further from the truth. Murray goes on to explain in the next paragraphs how from 1979 to the present day, the revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran has subjugated the Iranian people, condemned women to second-class status, imprisoned and tortured Iranian students, deployed a morality police, and instituted public hangings for people accused of crimes like homosexuality. The hope that given time, a moderate Iranian leader would emerge proved to be wrong. The Iranian regime, as Murray explains, has also spent decades colonizing and consolidating its power, not just in Iran, but also in adjoining areas of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. When Lebanon fell into a civil war in the 1980s, Iranians, through their proxy armies, primarily Hezbollah, consolidated the Shiite communities and took over the security and government in much of Beirut, colonizing vast swaths of land with their forces. They did the same in post-war Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003. And when the Syrian civil war started in 2011, Tehran's proxies, including Hezbollah, propped up the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Similarly, when a civil war broke out in Yemen in 2014, the mullahs of Iran backed and armed the Houthi-led militias to take over that country. The crucial point that Murray tries to drive home here is that while Tehran has for decades accused Israel of being a colonialist outpost of America in West Asia, it has been assiduously setting up colonialist outposts everywhere using proxies in the region. In the introduction, besides setting the initial context behind writing this book, Douglas Murray takes us through a brief tour of what this attack was like. One of the members of the volunteer group, United Hatzalah, that trains civilian volunteers to respond to car crashes and similar emergencies in Israel, said that 30 years of past incidents all combined didn't add up to an hour of what happened that morning. He also described how the Hamas terrorists were dressed in Israeli uniforms and similar outfits that they had taken from the dead Israeli soldiers in the military bases that they had already overwhelmed in the morning. They were now intentionally using this attire to further confuse and misdirect people in order to kill as many civilians as possible. In the days and weeks that followed, a 46-minute footage was compiled using the body cam footage of the terrorists, first responders, CCTV cameras, and the footage which was captured on the mobile phones of the victims. And this was then shown exclusively to journalists. Of the many documented atrocities, there was this one which is mentioned in the introduction of the book, which is uniquely gruesome and revealing at the same time. This was a footage which was captured in the kibbutz of Mefalsim. In the midst of the attack, there was this one terrorist who made a phone call back to his family in Gaza. The excitement in his voice was obvious. The following is the English transcript. "Hi Dad, the 3-minute call begins. Open my WhatsApp now and you will see all those killed. Look at how many I killed with my own hands. Your son killed Jews." The father replies, "May God protect you." "Dad, I'm talking to you from a Jewish woman's phone. I killed her, and I killed her husband. I killed 10 with my own hands." He goes on and on, repeating himself, boasting, "Dad, I killed 10 with my own hands. Put Mom on." "Oh my son, God bless you," say the parents. "Mom, your son is a hero," he boasts. She says, "I wish I was with you." After a while, one of the person on the other side asks the terrorist to come back, to which he replies, "What do you mean come back? There's no going back. It is either death or victory. Open WhatsApp. See the dead. Open it. Open WhatsApp on my phone and see the dead. How I killed them with my own hands." A characteristic feature that is unique to this conflict is the fact that few armies in history have had to fight a war in such a concentrated, built-up, and booby-trapped area in which the enemy has deliberately placed its military infrastructure within and amid civilian buildings, including mosques, schools, hospitals, and homes. A crucial question that Murray asks is, how do you fight an enemy that wants to maximize civilian casualties on its own side because it sees that as advantageous to shift international public opinion against Israel? Anyone following this conflict in the news would have certainly come across this allegation that Israel was committing some form of a genocide in Gaza. Using population figures, Murray also debunks this notion in his book that Israel has been committing some kind of a genocide against non-Jews, and that for the Palestinians living in West Bank and Gaza, it's like living in a concentration camp or an apartheid state. In 1948, the non-Jewish population, including Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, and Druze of Israel, was 1.5 lakh, or 150,000. By the year 2000, it had increased to 14 lakh, and by 2015, it had reached 20 lakh, or 2 million, and in 2024, it was 26 lakh. The non-Jewish population has actually grown 17 times since 1948. Similarly, the Muslim population of Jerusalem in 1948 was 40,000, and by the year 2022, it had increased 9 times to 3.7 lakh, or 370,000. Murray goes on to explain that the Arab and Druze population of Israel that make up 20% of the country's population have equal healthcare, housing, and voting rights as anyone else. A simple walk around any Israeli city would reveal a population that is astonishing in its racial and religious diversity. Murray has also mentioned the work of John Spencer, who is the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute and host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. He's someone who has served for 25 years as an infantry soldier, which included 2 combat tours in Iraq. He's also the co-author of the book, Understanding Urban Warfare. Incidentally, John Spencer recently wrote an article titled, "I'm a War Scholar, There is no Genocide in Gaza" on his Substack page. And I'd like to read a few paragraphs from this article because they're important to be understood in this context. Spencer writes, "Genocide is not defined by a few comments taken out of context, by estimates of casualties or destruction, or by how war looks in headlines or on social media. It is defined by specific intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, in whole or in part. War is hell. It's inhumane, destructive, and ugly, but it is not automatically a crime. Nations must not target civilians. They must follow the rules of distinction, proportionality, and take all possible care to avoid civilian harm. Israel is doing that. I have seen it." In Rafah this summer, Israel spent weeks preparing evacuations. It opened new safe areas and waited until civilians had moved before striking Hamas targets. That operation killed Hamas's top commander, recovered hostages, and kept civilian deaths very low. It was a clear example of Israel's extraordinary intent and actions to protect civilians while targeting only Hamas, a part of the story which is often ignored by those who reduce war to headlines and numbers. Spencer writes that death tolls from Hamas health authorities are often cited without question. We are told that 58,000 have been killed, including 17,000 children. But these numbers come from a terrorist organization. They mix civilians and fighters and count anyone under 18 as a child, even though Hamas uses teenagers and younger children as combatants. The figures are not independently verified and have been shown to contain false details including names, ages, and sex. Civilian deaths are tragic, but in Gaza, they're also part of Hamas's strategy. War is evaluated based on the actions of commanders, the goals set by leaders, and how well the military follows the laws of war, not by statistics taken out of context. Likewise, the laws of war do not prohibit war itself. They require that military operations distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, that force be proportional to the objective, and that commanders take all feasible precautions to protect civilian life. I've watched the IDF do exactly that. I've seen restraint, humanitarian aid, and deliberate compliance with legal standards, often at tactical cost. This is not a campaign of extermination. It's a war against Hamas, a terrorist army embedded in civilian areas by design. The law matters, so does precision, and above all, truth matters. Murray has written about the intense suffering that was made to visit upon hundreds of families of southern Israel on that fateful day. He has also shared some truly horrifying and heartrending stories of what the families of Kibbutz Be'eri went through on the morning of the 7th. The residents included a 74-year-old Canadian-born peace activist, Vivian Silver. Vivian had spent decades of her life working for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. She was the co-founder of an organization named Women Wage Peace, and she was also a member of the board of directors of the far left-wing human rights group B'Tselem. She used to take Palestinian children and others in need of highly specialized medical treatment from Gaza to hospitals inside Israel. When a house was set on fire by the Hamas militants who had entered the kibbutz, she had been burnt alive with it. There was in fact so little of her left that it took more than 5 weeks just to get enough DNA evidence to confirm this. Words cannot even capture the anguish and grisly psychological torture that the Baha family went through that morning, as Avida Baha, 51, with his wife Dana, his 13-year-old daughter, and 15-year-old son Kamal desperately tried to hide in their home's bomb shelter. And I'll just read 2 paragraphs from the book that describe the sheer horror that this family went through. Then they heard the safe room window being smashed open. 3 grenades were thrown inside the shelter through the opening. 2 of the grenades went into the sofa of the safe room, which absorbed much of the blast. They thought that they had survived, but then a gun was pointed through the window and someone fired 2 shots inside. 15-year-old Kamal, the boy, was shot in the chest. His mother died first because of the blast and smoke inhalation. Avida desperately told his daughter, "Mummy's fine. She's not feeling anything. She's good. Believe me, she's good." They laid her on the floor. At around 4 p.m., Avida's son Kamal started to take increasingly short breaths and told his father and sister that he didn't think that he was going to survive. He said one last thing to his father. Avida recalled, "He told me, Dad, when you bury me, please bury me with my surfboard." He was a surfer. He was a sailor. He liked the sea. And I told him, "Kamal, don't even say it." After a few minutes of shorter and shorter breaths, he stopped and died. The story of 74-year-old Bracha Levinson from Neru's kibbutz was equally gruesome. She was the child of Holocaust survivors, and she was alone in the house when the terrorists came in. She stood absolutely no chance against them. They recorded her killing using her own phone, and then used it to post a video on her Facebook page of her lying in a pool of blood as they stood over her. Her family and friends actually saw all of this happen from a safe distance. The terrorists then set fire to the home. It took over a month to identify her charred remains. Much of the videos circulating on social media from that day were scenes from the Nova Music Festival, which was attended by young Israelis in their 20s to celebrate love and peace. It happened to be a Druze family who had one of the food catering contracts for the Nova party. There were 3 brothers, Raif, 39, Amar, 33, and Rada, 33. It's impossible to know how many lives these 3 men saved, but when they found themselves in the midst of the chaos, they had a few advantages. Crucially, they all spoke and understood Arabic, so when the terrorists broke into the party that morning, they were more able than most of the party-goers to understand when they overheard them. Like everyone else, they remembered the moment when the terrorists broke in. It was around 6:30 a.m. when the first rockets fired by Hamas flew overhead. By 8 a.m., they were at their car and were being shot at by terrorists who had come in. They got out of their car and ran for cover. With around 30 other people, they managed to run to a patch of forest. As they ran, Raif saw people being shot and falling down all around him. He spent some hours among the trees before he decided with half of the group to make a run for an Israeli tank that they could see in the distance. As he was hiding, he could hear the Hamas terrorists and Gazan citizens. He saw and heard the Gazan Palestinians who were with Hamas encouraging the young Israelis to come out of hiding. But when anyone did, Raif saw what happened. At around 10:30 a.m., he saw the Hamas terrorists find a young party-goer. They set upon him with hammers and other tools. After killing him, he overheard them debating whether they should put him on the truck and take the body to Gaza. Amar was in the bar area that morning and came across another party-goer whose head had been caved in with hammers. He described how he wet the lips of the young man as he lay dying. Rada, the 3rd brother, could also hear the terrorists speak from where he was hiding. They said, come to us, they kept saying in Arabic. Rada was about 100 feet away from the terrorists as he was seeing them. He saw them debate what to do with a 19-year-old girl. Should we kidnap her or kill her? He heard them debate in Arabic in front of her. They decided to kidnap her. Then one of the terrorists came over with a gun and decided to shoot her in the head. Rada remembered her voice clearly. Don't kill me, she cried. He saw the terrorist shoot her in the head as she was still shouting. She was still shouting when only half her face remained.
My name is Mariam Alwan, and I'm with Columbia SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, and we are here today to demand that Columbia divest immediately from all stakes in Israeli apartheid.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! If Rafah doesn't get it, shut it down!
When Israel was still reeling under the infliction of an atrocity of this magnitude and had not even responded, there were already anti-Israel protests erupting in cities across the West. Hundreds of people on the streets of Germany and France began shouting anti-Jewish slogans. By the evening of the 7th itself, a huge crowd gathered outside the Israeli embassy in London and began setting off flares. Civil unrest was evident on the streets with protesters celebrating the massacres. Hundreds of people gathered at the Times Square in New York the next day on 8th in support of Hamas and carried out an anti-Israel rally while the terrorists were still murdering their way through the south of Israel and the battles were still going on. In the days to follow, these protesters grew to hundreds of thousands of people coming to the streets in support of a violent Palestinian uprising against Israel. There were marches that were waving flags of Palestine Islamic Jihad and other terrorist organizations. But the most peculiar thing happened in America. The primary focal point of anti-Israel protests was not on the streets, but in nearly every elite education institution in the country. There were actual professors of these elite universities who came out in support of Hamas and what they had done on October 7th. On 7th October itself, Yale University Professor Zarina Grewal wrote on X, "Settlers are not civilians. This is not hard." She also wrote, "Israel is a murderous, genocidal settler state, and Palestinians have every right to resist through armed struggle." Cornell University history professor Russell Rickford was filmed at an anti-Israel rally praising Hamas's massacre and telling the crowd that it was exhilarating. Albany Law School professor Nina Fernier wrote on X, "Long live the Palestinian resistance and the people of Gaza, tearing down the walls of colonialism and apartheid." A range of student groups at Harvard University issued a joint statement saying that they held the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. There was a martyr vigil at Georgetown University with signs saying "Free Palestine and glory to our martyrs." The protests at Columbia University went on for an entire academic year, with protesters filmed calling for jihad and issuing open calls for violence. Murray writes in a line in the book that sort of gets at the probable underlying psychological reason behind such a behavior exhibited so vociferously by students of these Ivy League institutions, which is that it seemed as though they had been trained to believe that the highest form of student life is protest and that they were simply trying to live up to the example set for them. Being clearly pleased with the ignorance of America's students, in May of 2024, the supreme leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Islamic Government, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, wrote a letter to the students of America. He said, "You are now part of the resistance front, and you've now begun a dignified struggle under the ruthless police pressure of your own government that evidently defends the oppressive and brutal Zionist regime." The fact that Khamenei and his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, have killed, tortured, and imprisoned thousands of Iranian students since 1979, or the fact that his regime publicly executes people convicted of homosexuality by hanging them from cranes, was conveniently left out of the letter. As the war continued over the next months, the IDF hit the command and control centers of Hamas using targeted airstrikes, followed by painstakingly going into Gaza, neutralizing Hamas operatives camouflaged in civilian clothing, uncovering tunnel entrances, looking for Israeli hostages, and securing a heavily booby-trapped area. On 31st July 2024, Ismail Haniyeh, the chairman of Hamas Political Bureau, was assassinated by a remotely detonated explosive device in Tehran. Murray writes that by September of 2024, the IDF fully turned its attention on Hezbollah in Lebanon and pulled a series of intelligence and military spectacles, with the pager devices of Hezbollah operatives blowing up across Lebanon and Syria. The Israelis had gotten into the supply chain of these devices and planted these explosives in them. On 27th September 2024, Hassan Nasrallah, the senior leader of Hezbollah, was killed in Beirut in an Israeli airstrike. By next month, Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the October 7th attack, was also killed by the IDF in a gun battle in Gaza. For someone who's really making contact with facts on ground and is looking for a workable solution out of this, the moral asymmetry in this conflict is hard to miss. What we have in front of us are two very different people. On one hand, you have these immensely radicalized and motivated organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestine Islamic Jihad that are willing to subvert every last cultural norm and principle of decency in war, stockpile munitions in places of worship, use financial aid for self-enrichment and smuggling in weapons, intentionally embed military infrastructure in civilian areas in clear violation of the Geneva Convention, and impoverish and immiserate their own population to shape global narratives and leverage outrage with the sole objective of annihilating Israel. And on the other hand, you have a state that in its existential condition replicates the condition of the entire West in a microcosm. A state whose military, like any other, does make mistakes, but never targets civilians as an intentional military strategy. It in fact takes immense pain and risk, often at tactical cost, to minimize civilian casualties by opening up humanitarian corridors, dropping leaflets, and sending millions of text messages to warn residents when a building was going to be hit. The truth really does matter, and one need not be from an Ivy League institution to have their heads screwed on straight about it. And so this brings us back to the question, how do you fight an enemy that worships, glorifies, and loves death more than you love life? Murray answers this by saying that the only reason why the brave men and women of the IDF fought and saved close to 150 hostages, including bringing back the dead bodies of more than 56, was not because they loved death, but precisely because of the value they placed on life. They fought for life, for the survival of their families, their nation, and their people. It's hard not to agree with Murray. I feel, come the day that both sides in this conflict can see eye to eye on this question, a new day will rise.
New day will rise, life will go on, everyone cries, don't cry alone, darkness will fade, all the pain will go by, but we will stay, even if you say goodbye. Tu dis adieu, tu ne partiras jamais, mon ciel dans mon ciel bleu, mes couleurs dans le cri, on se souhaite sous un ciel d'art.